Anytime you're ready. We set? Yep. Okay. So this really quick 2.5 or 3 hour session on real estate appraisal is very, very, very brief and basic compared to what the study of real estate appraisal can really entail. So we'll go over in just a minute. But it should give us enough basics to understand what you're going to see and what the background is of the appraiser or the appraisers that you're going to interface with who are providing valuations for properties you've got listed or working for buyers that are trying to get a loan or whatever you might see, or if you get into investing, that's a whole broader range of what appraisers do and that sort of thing. So appraisal regulation has constantly been ratcheted up since the late 1980s. Go back, look at what happened back then. We had savings and loan collapse. We had this recent financial meltdown, which was a near collapse of the banking system, reminiscent of what we had in the Great Depression. Well, we had the same thing happen in the 1980s with savings and loans. Kind of an interesting sort of mushrooming effect of real estate and other asset classes combined with bad banking practices that caused it to happen. Basically, under the Reagan administration, a lot of things were deregulated, and the savings and loan industry was one of them. And so in order to compete with their bigger bank counterparts, savings and loans began offering higher passbook savings rates. And then once they were offering higher interest, they had to make higher returns. So they started getting into riskier and riskier investments, some of which became speculative real estate investments in places they knew nothing about, creating eventually an asset bubble. You know what an asset bubble is? The idea is that values are inflated. It's just a big puffed up something that doesn't really exist. It's not really solid, and eventually the failure of that is kind of like the emperor's new clothes. You sort of wake up and realize there's nothing there. The assets couldn't support the values, and the savings and loans to constantly attract more money were constantly getting into riskier things. So in order to regulate a lot of that, this law was passed for REL, or FIREA, as some people pronounce it, and this put a lot of pressure on appraisers, as the recent financial meltdown did as well, with Congress basically taking the position that, look, as appraisers, you're our last best defense against ourselves. Because if we really, really, really want to purchase a property and we can get the financing, we're probably willing to overpay. As long as the appraiser says it's okay, and as long as the lender's willing to give us the money, we'll buy that thing. That's really kind of what we look at. And so Congress is saying we want appraisers to be held to a higher standard. We want them to be better trained. We want them to be, them to understand they're kind of the backbone of the system, really kind of answering to nobody except their own selves and their own conscience in terms of what they think market value of the property really is. So Congress chartered or launched or whatever the Appraisal Foundation, which is under some financial institutions council that exists. And the Appraisal Foundation then is a kind of Title 11 sponsored, chartered nonprofit that has 3 separate independent boards under it. The Appraisal Practices Board, this all exists at a federal level. Different than our part of the business is only regulated at the state level. This is regulated at the federal level. The Appraisal Practices Board basically offers volunteer advice to appraisers in certain areas of practice where they might need it. So if you're an appraiser and you want guidance, you can go, you get stuff from the APB, but you're not bound by it, nothing obligatory. The AQB, or Appraiser Qualification Board, sets up the regulations, the minimum standards for appraisal licensing across the country. And we'll look at this in just a minute. See, we don't have this in brokerage, right? In brokerage, everything is set at the state level. There is no minimum requirement for brokerage licensing in the United States. No such thing. But there is for appraisal. Again, this just shows how much more closely this is monitored by Congress than other things. So the AQB establishes those rules. What's the minimum amount of education, and what are the subjects, etc. And then every state is still free to set their own rules, and we'll look at what Illinois are in just a minute, but they must meet the minimum federal standard set by the AQB for what the appraiser must have for qualification before gaining licensure or certification. And then there's the Standards Board, Appraisal Standards Board, that is responsible for USPAP, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, and USPAP forms the industry guidelines for how every appraiser must function in whatever situation he or she comes across. The only real estate course I've ever taken as an undergrad or a graduate student at any level, anywhere, any time that I thought was awful was a 1 semester hour USPAP course, god-awful stuff. You know, it just was very dry, very difficult for me to follow because I had to practice as an appraiser, didn't understand how law applied, but it's all regulatory stuff, and appraisers have to go through USPAP continuing education as well over the years to make sure they don't lose track of the updates or changes. So it's a very heavily self-regulated, if you will, industry, but that self-regulation is directly overseen by Congress through the foundation itself. So if you're wondering sometimes why do appraisers do some things a certain way, it may not be license law per se as much as it's USPAP. USPAP lays out the rules. And those things are mostly controlled and staffed by appraisers from across the country, people who have a lot of good industry experience. So again, it's much more self-regulated, but also much more heavily regulated at the federal level industry than what we're used to in brokerage. So Illinois has this statute, the Appraiser Licensing Act, and it was amended a few years ago. And they don't have to amend it when there are changes, like there's some changes as of January 1st of this year, because they just tie the law back to the Appraisal Standards Board or the AQB or whatever, and as those things change, Illinois law changes automatically along with it. It's an interesting way to be able to do things. So there are 3 categories of licensed appraiser. I'm not going to test you on any of this kind of stuff as far as the appraisal licensing or these first few slides, but I want you to get a sense of what this is. And again, it's more detailed probably than what's in the text. I'm going to test you on actual value principles or appraisal process things, or that sort of thing. We'll talk about it in a little bit then. You can start off as a trainee. This is the basic idea. So, you know, it used to be called associate appraiser license. This is what I had for a little while. I never really used it, but I went through the process of getting it. In order to be able to get this, you must have attended college for at least the equivalent of 30 semester hours. So that's a year or more full-time college just to be able to be a trainee. The qualifying education or Q that's required, 15 hours at USPAP, that hasn't changed. In fact, none of this has changed since when I went through this in 03 and 04. An appraisal principles course and procedures course. The appraisal principles course would probably teach you guys nothing new. It's going to be a lot of the same basic real estate fundamentals and principles that you're learning here. But then appraisal procedures wherein there's usually something like the class was out and appraised a house together, something like that, where they've gone through the process of walking through an appraisal form. So that's what it takes to get started in terms of minimum education. So it's roughly the same amount of education as for a broker's license today, but you have to have more stuff like it's a college background, and then there's the supervisor trainee course, so that both the supervising and the trainee appraiser understand who does what. It's also important, I think, to understand a little bit that appraisers they must act and react and function differently in relationship to their clients, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. The other 2 categories are certified. So that was a trainee. Then you can, from that, if you want to stay in the business, you can either become a certified residential or a certified general appraiser. A certified residential appraiser can pretty much appraise any residential property up through 4 units. But they cannot appraise things like office buildings and shopping centers and industrial buildings, things like that. But the trainee, by the way, can appraise anything that anybody's willing to supervise. So if, as a trainee, you have the opportunity to appraise Willis Tower for a refinance or the purchase contract or whatever, you could do that so long as your supervising appraiser was willing to supervise you and oversee it and sign off on it at the end. But once you're done being a trainee, you have to pick a path: certified residential or certified general. So now, to be an appraiser in Illinois, to be a certified appraiser in any state of the country, you must have a minimum of a baccalaureate degree starting January 1st of this year. So if anybody thinks now or in the future about making appraisal your career, it takes a minimum of a baccalaureate. BA, BS, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what field. It could be in English literature, it could be in music theory and composition. It doesn't make any difference. You have to have a baccalaureate degree. You also have to have 2,500 hours of appraisal experience, and that takes at least a year to get. So even if you work 24/7, they're going to make you take more than a year to get those 2,500 hours, and that has to be verified and signed off by a supervising appraiser. So there's a lot of on-the-job experience before you're allowed to work on your own. That's a little different than what we see. You get into brokerage, if your broker will turn you loose, and if you're comfortable with what you got in front of you, you can just go out and be on your own. And as long as you don't mess anything up, you're good to go. Then, to get to that certified residential part, there's all this additional qualifying education that they have to take. So a lot more study. These are the number of contact hours, 15, 30, 20, to be able to study these kinds of things. So here, for certified residential, they're just going to study a lot more about appraising houses and duplexes and up through 4 flats. Certified general, it's not that much more, but it's a completely different path because it's different education. And it's 3,000 hours and a minimum of 2 years experience, and then this 225 hours of additional education, which is really also a big number, and it's much more general, much less about residential stuff and more about things like office buildings and unique structures, etc. So by the time somebody comes a certified general appraiser, they've been in the business, at least a couple of years, maybe more, with every single appraisal that they've done, every single one reviewed and signed off on by a supervising appraiser. Now, appraisers can make good money. A certified general who works on their own and stays busy can make $200,000, $300,000 a year. They can gross that in appraisal billings, less whatever it costs them for staff and taxes and all that kind of thing. But it takes you many years to get there. And this is a much more expensive path. There's not a public institution like Waubonsee that offers the courses, so there's no sort of taxpayer subsidized education. I think it's probably a couple $1,000s to take the initial courses to become a trainee. And then unlike broker licensing where you can take the test but never actually get into the business, in appraisal you have to pay for whatever it is, $350 license before you can even go sit for the broker or for the appraisal exam for the trainee license. And then once you get that, it's once you've paid that $300 some odd dollars, it's another $250 or $300, where we pay $50 to take the test or less, and $125 to get signed up. So much cheaper to become a broker, and not very many people, a lot less appraisers than there are real estate brokers. So a lot of education and training, especially on the job and while you're advancing along the way. But it's not a bad way to make a living, especially if you can do a wide variety of properties. Appraisal firms, because the business model is totally different, tend to be small. There's no money in being a supervising appraiser. So for example, on the typical residential appraisal, maybe somebody's paying $350 to have their house appraised for a purchase or a refinance. The amount of work that goes into doing that and the amount of work that it takes to supervise that or check and review all that, pretty much any certified appraiser is going to tell you it's no more work to just do the appraisal themselves than it is to check over somebody else's work. Every time they supervise an appraisal, their license is on the line. So it's not like brokerage where you're going to pocket a $5,000 commission and 50% goes to your office, to the office, and 50% goes to you, or whatever the split might be. You're talking about much smaller numbers, and so it doesn't really work that way. So you tend to have a lot of small 1, 2, 3-man woman shops, that kind of thing. There are some bigger firms like appraisal research counselors downtown and such, but that's atypical. The norm is very small. Once people are on their own, they're on their own, and there is no sponsorship. You don't have sponsorship like you have with brokers. A supervising appraiser is different. If I have to do 100 appraisals this year, I could have 100 different supervising appraisers. Whoever is willing to supervise me, I can have them do that. It's not like with brokerage where everything has to run through your one single and only sponsoring broker. That's not how appraisal works at all. So appraisers could theoretically work for multiple supervisors.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So they would have to contact the appraisal, or?
Who's they? You mean the trainee?
trainee.
Yeah, the trainee would have to make arrangements with somebody. Usually you do make arrangements with one appraisal firm, but you don't have to stick with that. So let's say you go to one appraisal firm and they say, sure, we'll take you on and we'll supervise your appraisals, but then they're too busy one week and they can't look at something that you've done. You're free to take that somewhere else and have somebody else supervise it, review it, sign off on it. The problem is that in some of these cases, some appraisers have said to their trainees, we'll supervise all you want, but we get 100% of the fee. In which case, if that's the case, you're working for free for the first several years while you're going through the learning and training process. That's a pretty tough barrier to entry, right, when you're getting into this to try and seek employment. So again, you can have that worked out in advance, but you don't have to stick with that one thing. And you don't need anybody's permission to just change. You just don't show up on Tuesday and go somewhere else instead to have your appraisal signed off by somebody else. You can certainly do that if you want to. Companies cannot be licensed, whereas with brokerage, right, a firm can be licensed. That's not true with appraisal, and only individuals can sign off on appraisals. So that model's a little bit different as well. So again, it's different being in that field or in that business. Not all appraisers work as independent contractors. There are lenders. I did a deal about 2 years ago where the lender was JP Morgan Chase Bank, and the appraiser was an employee of Chase Bank. And I don't know how common that is anymore, but this was a commercial deal, so maybe that's more common with certain kinds of lenders, but there are regular jobs, if you will, for appraisers within the real estate industry. Another group of companies that hire and pay as regular employees appraisers of both personal and real property are public accounting firms. It's important that certain entities, whether they're governments, nonprofits, publicly traded companies, have regular evaluations or, in this case, appraisals of property so that their stakeholders, shareholders, taxpayers, whomever, have the right to know, what are the assets on the books and how solid are those values. So that becomes sort of a regular job. So, and I point this out in part so that if it's sometime in the future, you're saying, I'm kind of tired of selling houses and what else is there for me? I'd really like to have a regular paycheck. Well, appraisal does offer that possibility along with property management. It's another area within the industry where you can have learned all this stuff, have it have some value, but find sort of a regular 9-to-5 job if that's more your cup of tea. And appraisal is much less about selling. It's much more mechanical. It's much more like an accounting position where here are the details, here are the facts, here's what I see from the research, here's the value. As opposed to, hey, why don't you use me to buy your house, or why don't you let me list your house, or that kind of thing. So it's a little bit different in that sort of way. We've been talking from the beginning about being the representatives, right? The best advocates for our clients' interests. Appraisers are categorically by USPAP forbidden from doing such a thing. So if you want to have your taxes appealed, for example, maybe one of the worst people to hire would be an appraiser. First of all, tax appeal valuations are not a licensed activity, and the appeal process itself is not a licensed activity, so anybody can make a representation to a taxing body for valuation assessment issues. And an appraiser specifically cannot go to such a situation and say, to the Board of Review, I'm here to advocate on behalf of my client who's hired me. Can't do that. The appraiser is instead supposed to be true to the numbers. What is the appraiser's view of market value? And that should be without regard for who's paying them. That's the basic idea. That's a really tough and emotionally detached position that appraisers are being placed into by Congress, effectively, saying we need you to be the true determiners of market value without regard for anything else regarding the property. One of the main problems that appraisers run into, and this was the problem that led to FREA, and a problem again that has led to some of the reforms since the most recent financial meltdown, is that appraisers get pressure. They appraise things and then the value comes in less than what the sales contract was, and it kills the deal basically. So the loan officer gets on the phone and calls the appraiser and says, hey, if you ever want to work for us again, you're going to have to look at this appraisal again. And that kind of contact today is illegal. It was not illegal 6 or 7 years ago, and it was a fairly common thing. So today, we'll talk about momentarily, appraisers are not supposed to have any unnecessary contact with the parties involved in transactions that they're doing, because all that can lead to is undue influence to encourage the appraiser to be maybe too optimistic, which is what Congress is concerned about, having values be up too high. So that's the basic idea. Who are they protecting? Lenders and everybody who invests money with them, the investors on properties themselves, anybody who's buying something, right? That's the whole idea. So everything there in USPAP says just be true to the value. Doesn't matter who hired you, the lender, a buyer, a broker, an investor, it doesn't make any difference. You don't advocate for the client, you just focus on value. Do appraisers ever advocate? Yeah, it's hard to escape. It's a human failing, it's going to happen. I've read plenty of appraisals where I've looked at that and thought, wow, they are really in somebody's camp here, but that's not supposed to be what they're doing. You're really just supposed to look at it dispassionately. Before we get into market analysis, let me finish on with talking a little bit about appraisal. So the The state of Illinois, as you all know, is a little strapped for cash, right? So just today, and I'll post this online if I think about it in the next few days, just today I read a public notice that the state of Illinois is looking to hire appraisers. They're looking for 3 appraisals to appraise what prime downtown Chicago location property that the state owns. What does the state own that's right in the heart of downtown that could be worth a lot of money? The Thompson Center. So, you know, the Thompson Center building, which is right on Randolph or whatever, and you know, I think it's actually maybe even inside the loop. The state's going to seek 3 appraisals, and it says right in the solicitation, it's a 4-page solicitation for appraisal quotes or offers, that one of the possible outcomes is that the state would sell the building. So we'll see what ends up happening with that, but I can just see where Rauner would think that way, like a corporate guy, right? What do? You've got assets, you don't need them. Why are we in the property owning business? So the state could look at selling it off and turning around and leasing it back, or moving the offices out eventually to cheaper space. So that request for proposals will require, you know, people to provide their qualifications, etc. And in order to make sure that they make a reasonable judgment, they'll get 3 different appraisals, and they'll use those, you know, kind of compare the 3 of them to decide what they're going to do. All right, any questions so far at all about any of that, you know, appraisal licensing and qualifications and all that?
Are appraisers that work for the township and the county down by the
Well, so like the township assessor, etc. Like Homer Offit for Aurora Township, he happens to be a licensed appraiser. There's no requirement when you go to vote, right? There's no requirement for somebody to get on the ballot that they're a licensed appraiser. But within USPAP, there's a section 6, I think it's called, but there's a section within USPAP that deals with something called mass appraisal techniques. And no matter how many times I've read that, I still don't really understand all what it says. But I will say that that part of USPAP is completely different than all other appraisals. So when township assessors, theoretically in conformity with USPAP, whether they're licensed appraisers or certified appraisers or not, should be able to use those mass appraisal techniques to come up with consistent values from township to township. The mass appraisal techniques allow for things that no other appraisal of no other property would use. So mass appraisal techniques are literally meant just for that, for assessment purposes and for no other reason. I think there are a lot more licensed, or excuse me, certified appraisers as township assessors today than there were just 20 years ago. I think that's much more normal, much more common. But I don't think there's any legal requirement for that to be the case. Other questions anybody has? Okay, and let's move on and talk a little bit about appraisal as it relates to us as brokers and our part of the business. So before I get on, I'm going to try to kind of, for a tongue-in-cheek analogy, see how many of you remember your Dr. Seuss. So since we're talking about appraisal, and appraisal begins with A, how good is your Dr. Seuss? Big A, little a, what begins with A? Anybody remember this? I've been asking this question for, I think, 13 years now, and nobody has ever answered it correctly. It's Aunt Annie's alligator. That begins that way. And it may seem a little bit odd to throw that in, but when I see appraisal, I think big A, little a. And the reason for that is we just learned here, right, that you have to be licensed to do an appraisal. There's certain requirements, a lot of training and education, and to me, that's appraisal with a capital A. So we as brokers can never say we are providing an appraisal or that we do appraisal work, because that takes an appraisal license, not broker license. But appraisal with a small a, just the basic definition of what is an appraisal, is that it's a market analysis. It's an opinion of value. It's a professional estimate. It's not hard science. And so we do the same thing as brokers. We just call it a CMA. It's a little bit different process, but similar techniques, but we can never refer to it as an appraisal because that requires a different license. So this comparative, or some people call it a competitive market analysis, the idea is basically to look at the marketplace and use market conditions of the recent past and the current conditions to make a determination as to what we think a property is worth. Now, CMA for a single family house is relatively similar to the sales comparison approach of a formal appraisal. It's less formal. You don't have forms you have to follow, where an appraiser has to follow that URAR that's in the back of chapter 19 in your book. You don't have to do that. You can create your own document And I like to do this as a broker. I have my own format, and it's got my photograph and my contact information and all that marketing kind of stuff that I also want to have with it, so that when I present a market analysis, it's both giving them the facts, but it's also part of my pitch for why they should list with me, or why the buyer should be happy that I'm representing them if it's a buyer's market analysis. And even within the MLS, which we'll look at in Real Estate 105, you can do the same thing. You can customize a CMA to use your own promotional or marketing materials. In general, however, you'll follow the same basic format or grid, the same idea of what are the important things that make the value of this property similar to these other properties that have recently sold. That part of the process is still pretty similar. Now, as of the first of this year, a CMA is now a licensed activity in Illinois. If it's performed separately from the process of getting a listing. It's always been considered part of licensed activity. If you do a CMA as part of obtaining a listing or trying to obtain a listing, that's always been a licensed activity. That's part of what you do as a broker. But now, if you do a CMA for somebody and it's not part of that, they just say, hey, I'll pay you $100 for a CMA, it's a licensed activity, which means that money can no longer go to you personally. It has to go through your sponsoring broker, and your sponsoring broker has to be willing to allow you to offer CMAs for a living. So, for example, when I go to list my own house, right, if I rely on my own market analysis and that's all I have when I list my house, I might be a little bit foolish by doing that, because I'm very emotionally involved and I have an interest in that property, and maybe I'm not detached enough from my own good. So I have often thought, well, maybe when I go to do that this next time, I will hire a couple of competing brokers and say, what do you need, $100, $150? Come in and give me a CMA. Because they'll be detached. The other advantage they'll know it's coming a little bit early ahead of the competition, and I'll get an outside opinion of staging issues, quality issues, what they think is comparable, which would be valuable. If I were to do that today, I'd have to arrange that through their sponsoring broker, or at least pay for it through their sponsoring broker. And that's, again, brand new as of January of 2015. So you're the first class going through this where we had that be an issue. That is not in your textbook, I don't think, because that's fairly new, no matter what version you got. All right, again, there's a grid in the book where they give you an example of a sales comparison approach. The CMA would look approximately the same. Same basic idea. And what do we want to know? What other similar properties have recently sold and or are currently on the market? Well, we hang most of our hat on, we put most of the weight on recently closed sales. Other similar properties that have sold in the last 6 months. The more identical they are, the more similar they are to the property we're trying to value, the better they are as a demonstration of what value is. That's what you're doing with the CMA. We will spend a little bit of time in Real Estate 105 and go through the CMA tool in the MLS and look at that and see kind of how that works mechanically. If we have time, I might actually even have you do one, but we probably won't actually physically do that. But this is something you will do regularly. Whether you work for buyers or sellers or both, you need to get comfortable with the idea of performing a CMA. And there's a lot of this that is not of exact science. That is no different for an appraiser than it is for us as brokers. The fact of the matter is, how we make a determination of exactly what a particular feature is worth is a little bit smoke and mirrors. It's a little bit of guess. So let's say, for example, if I asked you, all right, what is the value of a fireplace? Imagine a house or a townhouse, whatever you want to imagine. Imagine one with a fireplace, and imagine its twin without a fireplace. What's the value of that? What do you think? What's the value of a fireplace? Anybody have any idea? What kind of fireplace? Okay, I'm thinking sheet metal. Are you in a house or a townhouse? Is it a two-sided see-through fireplace in the master bedroom, or is it one of those sheet metal things sitting over in the corner, and maybe it's ventless, in fact, This is the problem, right? It's something like a fireplace could have a whole lot of rain. We can all be correct, and it's a matter of which one should be applied in a specific circumstance. And then, depending upon whether we're talking about the fireplace, in a $1 million house or in a $250,000 house, a similar thing may actually create a different value scenario, just simply because you're inside of a different animal, if you will, for the actual overall asset. So there's no exact science to this. The only way to learn it is by doing it in practice and getting a sense of how these things work. So you'll learn what you can learn in this class, which is very brief tonight, a little bit more in Real Estate 105, but then expect to really dig into this when you get into the business, because the first time you go to a listing, they're gonna expect you to have brought them a market analysis, and for you to be able to explain it and back it up. And the only way I've done that is spend hours over something that you could probably later do in 15 to 20 minutes. So you look mostly at recently closed sales, but also what's actively listed, because that's the current competition. You're not going to sell it for more than what somebody else is asking for the exact same thing. It would be very unlikely. And then what about the expired and canceled listings? In other words, those where somebody already tried to sell it and couldn't for whatever reason, and now they're off the market. Either the season's wrong, or they just gave up, or yes, there's a listing today at $325, but it actually started at $475 and it's been on the market for a year and a half. You want to know that when you're looking at that as competition to your particular property. So that's the order in which we would look at those. Again, this is true for sales comparison approach appraisal as it is for a CMA. Now, besides the CMA, which again you can do for buyers or sellers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that CMA when we're looking at that sales comparison approach, you can also do what are called broker price opinions, or BPOs. Now, a BPO is also now a licensed activity as of January 1. It was very, very common for unlicensed assistants to do BPOs. So if you remember back in real estate finance, I commented that lenders, particularly those out in the secondary market that own this pool of securitized mortgages, they statistically sample the houses that are in these pools to see what kind of condition are they in, are values going up or values going down. That would be a BPO, whereas a broker, they contact you and say, we'll pay you $80, and what we want you to do is just go out and take 2 photographs from the outside and give us a quick shot of what's going on with this particular piece of property. So many agents, to make money, would hand that off to their $12 an hour unlicensed assistant who could do 2 of those in an hour, and it was a way for brokers to make money. Today now, it's very clearly that this is a licensed activity if this is done other than for somebody. So it's something that has to be done by a licensed assistant, and or the compensation has to go through your sponsoring broker. So it's the kind of thing that you need to be aware of. You can still have your unlicensed assistant do a lot of the work, but you have to sign off on it, and your license is at risk if it's not good, or if it's poor quality or whatever. Sometimes, rather than doing BPOs, lenders will hire appraisers to do drive-bys or drive-by appraisal where they don't go in. That's cheaper than a full appraisal, but it's still more money than a BPO done by a broker. It's possible even on a BPO that you wouldn't even have to go to the property. You just take data out of the MLS basically and give them value issues. Okay, yeah, and then so this is also exempted. The BPO and CMA are exempted from the Real Estate Appraiser Licensing Act, so it's understood that these kinds of valuations can be done by brokers. And if you do a BPO for a lender, you'd use a standard Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac form to go. Questions about those at all? All right, well, let's take a little bit of time and start digging into this idea of value. I think the second night of class, we talked a little bit about real estate economics, maybe even the first night, where we talked about kind of what drives demand and how do we establish value because it's so local. It's right down to the floor of a condo building or to the section of a particular subdivision or whatever. So we're going to return to that for the only other time in the class and talk a little bit about urban land economics or real estate economics here when we're talking about value. So this simple acronym of DUST serves as a way to help you remember the overarching issues that if any of these are missing, you probably have little to no value, really probably no value for the particular property, right? There has to be some demand for it. If there's no demand for a property, how could it possibly have any value whatsoever? If there's nobody to buy it, it's worthless. Does that ever happen? Yeah, the answer is true, yes. Right now, in areas of Chicago, particularly in South Cook County, there's a little bit of kind of Detroit-esque sort of stuff going on. What are they doing in Detroit? They're removing tens of thousands of units of housing every month. Because the city has lost, whatever, 1 million residents, or maybe not 1 million, but hundreds of thousands of residents. And so what are they going to do with all that stuff? They're tearing it all down and turning it back to vacant land, and they haven't figured out where it's all going to go. There's a little bit of that in Chicago. There's something now called the Cook County Land Bank, which is a government-funded organization whose job is to figure out what we do in these neighborhoods where there's no demand for property, even if we were to give them away? Do we tear those down and turn them into vacant lots and maybe demolish a whole block and make it a park? Is that the cheaper alternative? Or do we maybe fix up one or two houses on that block at taxpayer expense, hoping that that will attract other people to that area and help it to gentrify naturally through market forces? That's what Cook County Land Bank is all about. So there are places right now, not too far from here, where there is zero demand for property, hence it's effectively worthless, so the government has to step in and figure out what to do with it. Utility. There has to be some use for the property. So functional utility is sort of the term we would apply when we're talking about describing what the usefulness of a property is. So a shopping center has for its functional utility the fact that you can put retail stores or offices or other kinds of things in it. A house functional utility is going to come down to how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how big is the garage, does it have a basement? That's functional utility. What can you literally physically do with the property? If the property has no utility, if it's not useful for anything, again, it's not going to have any value in the market. It might be better to just demolish it and, and start all over again. And you can have functional utility problems just for the improvements. The land might have some value, but maybe the home itself or whatever the property's on it is actually worth less than zero because you've got to pay money to tear it down and start over. Scarcity, there's a limited supply of improved, especially real property and just of land. I don't remember if all this stuff came up in that previous chapter or not, but the idea of scarcity, here you look west and you just keep seeing more and more land. Well, we can just keep developing forever, but that's not true. You eventually run out of property. So that limited supply creates value. Hence the discussion we had earlier about how lakefront property, golf course property, those unique lots in a brand new subdivision appreciate much faster because they're more limited. Their supply is more constrained, right, than the typical lot, of which there might be hundreds of lots that just back up or side up to other houses. So that's, that's where that comes from, that idea of the more scarce, rare, unique something is, the more likely you're going to get a return. Hence my saying to you from the beginning of the course, investing in real estate is not about buy low, sell high. It's about buy high and sell higher. You'll get a better percentage return if you purchase a property that is in fact in greater demand or more scarce. That's my general experience. And lastly, transferability. And this is so routine in the United States, we don't even think about it. But having seen this in some other countries, I can tell you that if a property isn't transferable, readily transferable, it has a huge impact on its value, maybe again even rendering it worthless. I lived in a country where more than 90% of the property could literally not be transferred. If you own property, you were going to die owning that property because you could not give it away, sell it, or do anything. This is true in some small countries. I think it's true in part. I think there are places in Hawaii where only indigenous people can own land. I lived in Samoa. It's same ethnic group, with the Polynesian people. And in Samoa, other than in the main town or out near the airport, that land cannot transfer. It always stays in a larger family unit. So that's how it works. There's no real estate taxes, nothing else, but that land is central to that culture. They recognized a century ago, when it was a trust territory of New Zealand, that if that land was available for sale, it would get gobbled up within hours. Imagine it today. If all of Samoa were all of a sudden available for sale, by the end of 24 hours, it would be owned by the Japanese, the Australians, the Chinese, the Americans, and whomever else. It wouldn't be owned by Samoans. In fact, to me, this is a really funny story, but this is kind of telling in the clash of real estate cultures. Samoa was taken over by Germany in 1899. The U.S. went and took American Samoa for its harbor. Germany took what had been known as Western Samoa, and Germany lost it in World War I. Literally, New Zealand invaded before the German soldiers even knew they were at war and took the country from them. So you had this interesting thing that happened when Germany, a Western power, took over Samoa in 1899. They would buy land from the Samoan families, and after a couple of years, the families would come back and want their land back. And the Germans would explain, no, look, we bought your land. Right, but now we want it back. And they weren't offering to buy it back. The concept of land ownership was so foreign that literally the indigenous people there, the only thing they could conceive of was that they were being paid to allow these people to use their land for a while. and without some specific lease agreement or something that they understood, they literally just would take their land back or get into fights or squabbles. And that's why New Zealand, when they took over the country in 1914, said no more transfers, no more land can be transferred. The only thing that makes any sense is to protect the indigenous culture. So here, transferability is relatively straightforward. Public records, think about it. You can go anywhere, anytime, and find out who owns what and what debt they have on it, what the liens are. All of that is central to the ease of transfer. This is not as easy as going online and just buying 100 shares of General Motors stock in your trading account or your retirement plan, but it's not that far behind that. When you can go and do an evaluation and close on a $1 billion high rise in a 30 or 45 day period, that's pretty stunning when you think about it. And you know, most of your time there is probably evaluating private documents like leases as opposed to public records. So again, if you don't have demand, if there isn't some usefulness for the property, unless there's some finite supply of it, and unless you can transfer it, there's no value. Any of those things is missing in large part, then a property is worthless or going to be near worthless. We've used the term a lot already, but this is a key real estate term, market value. What does that mean exactly? So here we finally define it. Market value, again, is not fact, it's opinion. It's critical to our understanding of what we're talking about when we say, what's the market value of that house? What's the market value of Sears Tower? Willis Tower, excuse me. But it's simply the most likely price that a property is going to fetch or get bring in a sale. So the market value of something is, what do I think it would sell for today? If I'm the appraiser or the broker valuing that property, what am I valuing it? I'm valuing it today. So I'm telling you, in my opinion, if it's sold today, it's worth X. So when you do your CMA, the market value is what you tell the client, this is what I think your property is going to sell for. When the appraiser does their appraisal, they're going to say, here's a number. A main difference between a CMA and an appraisal is the appraiser has to come to one final estimate of value. I think this property is worth, $178,000. You as a broker can say, I think your place is going to sell somewhere between $175,000 and $182,000, or whatever you find at the moment. You can give a range. An appraiser doesn't have that luxury. You know it's not an exact science, as does the appraiser, but appraisal clients are expecting a single number. What's my place worth? Is it worth 560 or 565? Which is it? For you, you could say, I think it's 560 to 575. I recommend you list, in the following number. And then you can kind of negotiate that listing price. Or you can sort of recommend and negotiate the asking price on behalf of your buyer, with your buyer, before they make that first offer, depending upon what you're doing with your marketing analysis. So again, it's just an opinion. So market value is market value. The assessor gives you market value. That was that residential fair cash value on the tax bill. The appraiser gives you market value when he or she says, this is what I see for the market value of your house. And you give them market value when you say, I think your place is going to sell somewhere between 175 and 180. It's all the same thing. It's just some professional's opinion of what the property is likely to sell for. So if we go back briefly to leasing, and we talked about the economic rent would be the market value of that space in terms of leasing. What do I think it would lease for today or available today for leasing, as opposed to contract rent, which was what the contract or the lease itself was going to say the rent was. All right? Market price, now that's fact. So as far as I understand, Willis Tower has sold for $1.3 billion. I don't know what market value is because I would have to have seen the broker price opinion or the broker's analysis. I would have to see the appraisal. But if 1.3 billion, if it's $1.3 billion for the closing price, closing sale price for Willis Tower, that's market price. That's no longer an opinion, right? That's fact. So we use recent facts, what did something actually sell for, to help us formulate our opinion of what something now is likely to sell for. That's what happens in the sales comparison approach. That's what we tend to do with our market analyses. These are very different. If you get a straight definitional question, value and price are not synonymous. However, before the night is over, there is at least one time where I will use value and price interchangeably, and I'll try and remember to point that out when we get there. It has to do with the direct capitalization portion of the income approach to value. So again, definitionally, they're different. Value is an opinion, price is recorded fact. market cost has to do with what you spent or what the current owner of the property or recent owner of the property spent on something, which probably has nothing to do with either price or value. And as a real estate broker, particularly if you get into listings, particularly if you're dealing with housing, you're going to have the pleasure of explaining this to people. Because it's not at all uncommon for you to show up to list a property and have somebody say to you, well, first let me paint you a picture. Think about a subdivision where all the houses in the subdivision are relatively similar. A little bit of customization, but all of them have some siding. Maybe the siding is vinyl, maybe the siding is cedar, maybe some of it's hardy board, whatever. But it all has a similar look and appearance at least from 100 feet away. Now just think about this for yourself. Let's imagine right now that you had an option on a house. Nothing else changes about the house. You have the right to choose between one of two things, either natural cedar siding with all the warmth, goodness of, lovely smelling cedar with a coat of stain on it that has to be restained, every 10 years maybe, or vinyl siding with its clackety, vinylness to it, but that you never, ever, ever have to touch from now until long after you're dead. So which would you prefer on your house? Assuming there's no real difference in market value, would you rather have cedar or vinyl? Just by show of hands, how many people prefer cedar siding over vinyl? Raise your hands. Okay? How many of you prefer vinyl over cedar? All right, a little heavier on vinyl this time. Usually I get about a 50-50 split. And on average, that's pretty much the case. So if you get that sort of scenario where you've got a fairly even split, then you're not going to see a difference in market value, right? Because somebody's not willing to pay a premium necessarily. And even if you have a premium desire for vinyl, it doesn't cost more, so you're probably not going to see a premium in the price. Well, what about the person who's living in one of those houses and they really don't like vinyl siding at all? And for the 10 years they've been living in that house, they've had this desire that they wish they lived in a house with cedar siding. And maybe the house is a little drafty, it's a little bit older, and they see Tyvek, and they understand that that's a way to get this house wrap product by DuPont and other similar competitors, where you're going to put this Tyvek or Typar or whatever it is on the house to reduce draftiness. So they pay $30,000 to somebody to remove all the siding, put new house wrap on there. Maybe they touch up a little insulation or something here or there, a few penetrations, put some great stuff around the cable as it comes in the house, and then they put cedar siding on the house. In fact, maybe they replace the windows. Make it 40 grand and they have all brand new 3-pane, thermal insulated, low E, argon, whatever windows. When you sit down with them to do a market analysis, what are you going to do? You're going to look at the market, what has recently sold in that market. You're going to look at the basic features of these other houses, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms. You won't even know from the MLS, nor will you probably care whether they're vinyl or cedar. And for the most part, you're not going to have inspected these things to figure out which ones were the windows replaced in or not. You're just going to kind of look at the sort of broad picture of the market. And when you sit down with these people and you're going to say to them something like, I think your house is going to sell for that 275 to 285,000 range, one of the things they're going to want to tell you is, yes, but we just put $40,000 into the house for new siding, new house wrap, and new windows. That's the market cost, right? That's what they spent. But you're not giving them a value based on market cost. You're giving them market value as what you think somebody's going to pay for it. So what you get to say to them in return is, well, that's nice, but my opinion of value is that your house is going to sell for somewhere between $275 and $285. That $40,000 that they've invested in this hypothetical situation, and this happens, by the way, ultimately becomes worth almost nothing. And who's the one who gets to break it to them? You see what happens? Right? You're the experts, and you've shown up too late. So let's back up a little bit and kind of lay out some scenarios about people in general. Imagine that tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon if you're home, or any time you want to go, imagine that you were going to have somebody come to your house, your apartment, your condo, or whatever, and their sole job was going to be to give you an estimate for what they were going to charge you every week or two to come in and clean. Right? You're busy, hard to keep up with stuff, or you've got other things you want to do. I don't care what the reason is, but you want somebody to clean your place. So they got to give you an estimate about what it's going to take to clean it. Before they get there, what are you going to do? You're going to clean the place. Somebody explain that to me. But that's the answer I've been getting for all these years I've been doing this. So when we go to put our houses on the market, all those things that we never did for all the years we live in it, what do we want to do? We want to start replacing the stuff that now we're not going to get any value out of personally. So it's important to understand that with real estate, there's two ways to get value. One is market value, right? What can I sell it for? It's an asset. How much can I make on this? And the other is through use. So if I replace all the windows in my house 10 years before I sell, I get some energy savings, and I get the joy of going, wow, my windows go up, and they go down, and they don't rattle in the openings, and they don't lean to one side when I'm standing outside, you know. That's completely different than replacing those windows 6 weeks before I list the house, and all I'm going to be able to do is, I put $10,000 in, how much am I going to get back? $6,000, $7,000, $8,000? I'm probably not going to get all that money back, because the people who are really going to get the energy saving benefit and the joy of having windows that go up and down are going to be the buyers, the new people who move in. So if you can get to sellers soon enough, before they replace the siding, before they replace the windows, before they undertake major renovations, you can save them tons of money. You can convince them, don't clean if you're having somebody come to your house to give you an estimate for cleaning. Let them see what needs to be done, right? And so this is an incentive to you, I hope, to go out and promote yourself early on by talking to people, hey, if you're ever thinking about selling, let me know way ahead of time before you do any renovations or repairs or major alterations, because if you let me come through and help you plan this, we can help you target what's the most cost-effective work to be done. And then people will get a more positive return on the money they invest. And frankly, at that point, they won't care if they pay you 5% or 7%, because there'll be so much money ahead that, you know, they'll be thrilled, and they may not get competitive quotes on the services for selling their house, because you've already proven your worth to them. You convince them, you know what, 40 grand on that stuff isn't really worth it. You're going to get 0 back on the siding and the tie bar, and you're going to get maybe 6,000 out of 10 on the windows. You're better off just selling the house for 10 or 12,000 less, because you'll sell it faster and you'll have more cash at the end. And let the buyers put the money in. On the other hand, there are some things that do make sense to do, like a fresh coat of paint that the homeowners can do themselves, simple staging things. Remodeler magazine, at least once a year, publishes a list, and you can get this through the Illinois Association of Realtors, you can just Google it online, whatever, of what the returns are. And there are very few things that you can do and get an automatic 100% return on the average house. Usually you get most of your value back or some percentage of it back, so that's where it makes sense for the homeowner who moves into a place who's going to be there for a long time, because eventually you'll feel like you get your money back, and you will have had all those years of use of having things that actually work. Gutters that are 6 inches that can handle the ice damming, for example, instead of 4 inches that are constantly overflowing and causing icing on your driveway or whatever it might be. So again, that's this whole idea of market cost, independent of value, and it's something you need to become more and more familiar with the more you're in the business. So if you haven't done this before, just for fun, Google the idea of, you know, what returns can I get? As the market changes, those numbers will change. But right now, you know, basic curb appeal stuff, simple landscaping jobs that the owner can do themselves are a much better investment than, say, a basement finishing. If you finish a basement and you drop 30 grand with a contractor, at best you'll get back 15 if you're selling it right away. It's just not worth the money on that kind of basis, right? So we talk to homeowners and to residential clients in 2 different ways when it comes to property. You can call it a house, or you can call it a home. And these terms are not synonymous. A home is your nest, it's where you live. A house is an object. So when we talk to sellers, we call it a house because we're trying to detach them from them being there. We want them to be reasonable about the pricing. We want them to forget about the emotion of raising their family there or whatever that may have happened. We want them to focus on, this is a mechanical, functional place, and you can replace that. When we talk to a buyer, we tend to talk to them about a home. Wouldn't you like to have a home of your own? because then they get the sense of, oh, this is warm and fuzzy and wonderful. So, use those terms carefully and judiciously in terms of how you talk to people. It has a big impact on how people think and act and react. I was taught constantly, and I've heard it recently, I have an agent, she's been advertising on WBBM News Radio, actually in Chicago, in my market area, in Glen Ellen area, and used to tell sellers at listing appointments, start packing. Because you want them to be thinking of themselves as being somewhere else, being gone from there. It's an investor mentality. Investors purchase real estate for dispassionate reasons. Homeowners purchase homes for emotional reasons. And you want your sellers to be emotionally detached and your buyers to find something to which they can emotionally connect. And that all kind of ties back to all of this value sort of stuff. Questions about any of that before we move on? All right. Basic value principles. So we're going to run through these, and then once we get through these, or maybe before we get to the end, we'll take a bit of a break. Anticipation. The idea of expecting something to change, for the good, for bad, for whatever. This is such an important value principle, it actually underlies the entire income approach to value. One of the three approaches we're going to talk about in more detail tonight is based upon the expectation that you're going to collect the rent. Right? If you buy an apartment building, so you and a bunch of partners get together and go buy an 8-flat, what do you have but a building and a bunch of promises from people you don't know that they will pay you? Tell me that's not anticipation. Anticipation can show up in other ways. Right? If you expect that the home you live in might someday be rezoned commercial and be ideal for doctor's offices, law offices, whatever, you can start to watch that value increase as other people start to buy into that idea that, oh yeah, the downtown core area is moving out, more houses are being converted to offices. That means that eventually, as the demand is there, more areas, more houses are going to become businesses. Take a look at some place like Geneva. Those businesses along 3rd Street, et cetera, are worth, that real estate's worth a lot more in a business district than it is if those were just a bunch of single family houses 2 blocks over. Commercial real estate has a lot greater value. So that doesn't happen overnight. Somebody didn't just decide all at once, let's take these houses and make them commercial. It shows up in the newspaper, people talk about it for years, there's an evolution, it starts to happen over time. All of that has value changes, and that anticipation happens in time. So that's a very important value factor. Change should be self-explanatory, right? Nothing is stagnant. It's a very dynamic world in which we live, and the real estate market is no exception. Anything that changes can have an impact on value, good or bad. Any little change. So that is an issue. I put in here one of my favorite phrases, even the rate at which change changes. Nothing stays the same. So, understanding kind of what are the value drivers for a particular piece of property, and that if any one of those changes, or factors that might impact those are changing, you can begin to sort of predict the future farther in advance. You won't always be right because some intervening event may not happen or may not happen what you expect to happen, but it may very well change things. For example, 5 years ago, it was very easy to see the upswing in senior housing. It's what they call the pig and the python kind of phenomenon, right? The baby boomer generation is simply, there's simply so many of us, kind of like, when the python swallows the capybara or the pig, whatever, you can just see that big knot in the thing as it's digesting it over a period of a few days. That's what we have as a society. We have a population not of older people. Where are they all going to end up? Well, eventually they're going to end up in various kinds of senior-related housing. And so you could see that coming simply because you could examine the population demographic. So you could predict the future that, oh, maybe I should be looking at investing in companies that buy medical real estate, that buy senior or develop senior real estate stuff, because that's going to be a growth area. Or maybe I should look at that, or maybe I should become a brokerage expert in that area. NAR just came out with a new designation about 5 years ago called the Senior Real Estate Specialist, SRES. Never existed before. Why? Because there are so many of us now who are reaching retirement age, and that's a different housing mentality. This requires a different sort of focus. And probably the average 75-year-old doesn't necessarily want a 30-year-old broker. They'd probably rather have somebody else with a little bit of gray hair or maybe no hair who's got that designation and knows exactly what their needs are at that stage in life. We talked a little bit about supply and demand, and it comes up again really at the end of this list, but that has to do with competition. If there's 10 of the same house for sale in the market, that has an impact on your value. Even though it's nothing to do with recent sales, it has everything to do with predicting the future. How likely is it that you're going to be able to sell your place for more money than what everybody else is asking? The answer is not very, right? It's almost impossible. So that's an important thing to look at in terms of competition. How far afield is going to vary depending upon what property type you look at. It can be sort of significant as to what you're looking for. So competition in the demand area can be lots of buyers looking for the same property, multiple bids. You have areas today where you're getting multiple bids, and then areas where you're getting no bids, because again, real estate is extremely local. Competition and supply is where you've just got a lot of inventory. Just for question, anybody have a sense of what kind of market we're in general right now in terms of buyers and sellers, buyers market, sellers market? What would you describe it as? Anybody have an idea? Buyers. Okay, why do you think it's a buyer's market? It's what we've been coming through, right? I mean, because there's been a lot of low-priced inventory. But actually right now we're kind of thin on listing inventory in a lot of areas. It may not necessarily be true right here, but like where I live in my subdivision, there are 160 homes. As of 2 weeks ago, there were 2 houses on the market. As of 1 week and 6 days ago, there was 1 house on the market. The second that came on sold within a period of days. And it's pretty high price per square foot, I think, based on last year. But the point is, there's nothing else for those buyers. It fit what they were looking for, and they didn't have any other choices. So rather than get into a bidding war, what do? They just bought something that I think is probably 5, 6, 7% over the market. But it's not over the market if the whole market shifts and reacts to this lack of inventory. So it's kind of interesting, but there's still not a lot of sellers putting prices on property, and the market is almost getting dysfunctional in some areas, where you're going to have buyers looking for properties that just don't even exist, which eventually leads you to more new construction, if you can afford the time and all that to wait for it to get constructed. So I don't know. Again, it's a little bit spotty. We'll kind of see. There's greater demand farther to the east, where I am, or even in the city. A year ago, I was showing a gal. Last summer, I was showing a gal 1 bedroom, 1 bath condos at Millennium Park in Chicago. And there were 2 on the market. There were 2 under contract at the time, below $200,000. I have not seen anything in that building listed for less than $245 in the last 6 months. Just stunning. But I'll bet that property has gone up 20% or more in 1 year. No more foreclosure properties. They've hit the rental cap, so you can't fall back on it as an investment property. Only owner-occupant buyers. So just a complete change in what's happened in that market. And that's going to happen everywhere, kind of in time. The foreclosures will just one day be gone. The normal market will be all that's left, and it'll, if it doesn't, we don't get more inventory, it's going to be a seller's market here pretty quickly. All right, conformity, and I put this note: homogeneity maximizes value. But the principle of conformity says if the homes conform to their surroundings, or any property conforms to their surroundings, you're more likely to get a higher valuation. This doesn't have to be true just with housing, but I'll give you that example first. So if you imagine a nice quality subdivision with maybe the high soaring 2-story Georgian revivals and Victorian homes that all have the big high pitched roofs, and they're very large, sort of imposing kind of residences. And then in the middle of that subdivision, you have this really nice architecture, but it looks kind of like a Frank Lloyd Wright schooner house, completely different style, prairie schooner design or whatever, sitting in between these all other houses. All of the other houses are a similar architecture. This one is different. If this one more modern or throwback style, whatever it is, were in a subdivision of like homes, it would have a higher valuation. But there, it looks out of place. It just feels odd. And somebody who really wants that might want more of that, and might prefer that there was other more modern or different kinds of architecture around it. So you're not going to get as high a value for it as if you put it on a lot by itself or in a subdivision where everything was the same. Conformity can also apply across property types. So Well, let me back up a little bit and just think about a tear down community. When a community becomes a tear down area, you have a lot of older 1, 2, 3 bedroom bungalows, for example. And then somebody will come in and tear one of those down and build a McMansion or whatever you want to call it, a family home. Well, right now, you got that one family home and everything else is still bungalows. There's no way you're getting maximum value for that because it sticks out and looks odd. But as you start to go in and tear down more homes, you start to see that, oh, people can realize, oh, that's the future. I can see the future. This is all going to look like these homes in 5 or 10 years, so I'm willing to go ahead and buy one of those out-of-place, bigger 2-story brick homes because in 10 years, all the homes here are going to look like that. That's another thing that you can see that kind of thing. Back to my example of across property lines, I remember many years ago out on North Aurora Road, which is an extension of Indian Trail heading into Naperville, I worked at a factory. You've got the Burlington line just to the south of North Aurora Road. Some factories there. In fact, O'Reilly's just built a brand new warehouse and store there. And all along that one side is all industrial. Immediately on the other side, you have residences in Country Lakes Estates or Country View Estates, whatever it's called, that always seemed odd to me. I worked in one of those plants in the late 70s and 80s, and I thought, why would anybody want a house across this 2-lane road from industrial property? And it isn't just that. Why would anybody want to build an industrial building with heavy truck traffic where they're going to be competing with cars and maybe have noise zones, reduction zones, whatever, can't use your exhaust brakes because you're near a residential area? It's no good for anybody when you have property uses that are so different from one another that they really don't fit well, right? The houses that are in the glide path at O'Hare are still houses of a certain size, but they don't conform with that industrial feel of being near a major airport. So again, conformity is an important issue regarding property value. Contribution just says every piece adds something or subtracts something. No matter how small it is, it might have an impact. So a fresh coat of paint is a contributing factor to the value, even though it may not have spent much. And when you're trying to assess value, either as an investor or as a broker or as for your own property, you have to be able to sort of break this down. What contributes what value? Because if you can't get a sense of what contributes what value, how do you advise anybody or make your own determination of what do we do? Do we tear out the kitchen cabinets and replace them, or can we paint them? What's the contributing value to that? If you've never watched it, I think on one of the ABC digital channels, there's a couple of gals that I've seen from time to time who do the shoestring budget renovation of places. One that I saw recently, maybe even last night, where they renovated the kitchen and did it almost entirely with paint, including painted countertops, stainless steel looking finishes on white appliances that they painted on, painted tile looking backsplash. It's stunning what they were able to do for probably $900 or $1,000 in a couple of rooms. That's the kind of thing, if you can do that sort of thing, you can improve the value, and maybe somebody else comes in and tears all that out, but they don't feel bad doing it because it's just paint. Whereas if you put tons of money into that kitchen, new cabinets, new counters, and somebody comes and likes the house, they might not like that kitchen and they're not willing to tear out $20,000 in cabinets and countertops to replace them, but they might be willing to do it with older stuff. So again, you have to really have a sense of how all that works because each piece contributes value and how people see properties. Highest and best use formerly was included in every appraisal. Now it's not included very often at all. I see them in commercial and industrial things. You'll see it where redevelopment is a possibility, but in the typical single-family appraisal, we don't even bother to do this. What highest and best use does is it's kind of a screening process. It's like putting something through a sieve. If you're familiar with a sieve, it's like a screen. I always think of it as like a funnel. If I put a big screen at the top, it'll keep the big rocks from going in, but the smaller rocks will go through. Then a little bit tighter screen, and then sort of that bigger rocks will be held up, but the smaller ones will still go through until down at the bottom you've got nothing but sand or really fine limestone screenings. That's what you're doing with highest and best use. You look at it in whatever order, though this is the order in which I tend to think of it, or this is actually the order it's in the book. I always think physically possible first, but the idea is looking at a piece of property, any piece of property, and trying to figure out what's going to maximize profitability for that? What's going to get us the highest possible value? Hence the term highest and best use. So first you look at the piece of property, either vacant or as is, whichever it is, and what's legally permitted there. Because if it's not legally permitted, An appraiser is not going to consider it, nor should you as an investor. You could purchase something with the hypothetical that you hope you can get something rezoned, but that's kind of a long shot. Do you really want to take that risk? What's physically possible? Okay, so legally, for example, I can put a single family house or a duplex on this property. But is it big enough? Could I physically build the 2-unit and have it be big enough? Because if it's not physically possible, then I've already said my only use here is single family. But if I could do either single family or a duplex and the lot's big enough that both of them could fit, then it's a matter of, well, what's economically feasible? What is it going to cost me to renovate or to build or whatever I'm looking at to do? I'm trying to eliminate possibilities. So once I get down to if there's only one possibility, that's my highest and best use, because that's the thing that's going to get the highest value. But if I get down to the very last thing and I still have possibilities, like Batavia, Geneva property, for example, where you've got, this is really common in Batavia, a lot of single-family homes that were duplexes. They were single-family homes. They were turned into duplexes in the 60s or 70s or 80s. Now they've turned back to single-family houses in many cases because they were worth more as single-family houses. And you're called on to value this. And it could be either way. Which way are you going to, because you're only going to give them one market value. Or the appraiser's only going to give them one market value. You're going to pick the one that's higher. That's maximally productive, more profitable. That's the basic idea. This is how we look at things in the United States, is what's going to give us the highest possible return for that property. We don't value it based on a lower possibility unless we're directed to for some other reason. So that's the idea of highest and best use. The assumption is we always look at a property based upon what will yield the highest value for it. There's no point in doing the valuation otherwise. Well, again, it's a good tool as an investor to look at something and try and decide. And it's been kind of interesting to me because, you know, in the 50s, 40s, 30s, when those homes in Batavia were built, 20s earlier, highest and best use was single-family house. In the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the highest and best use was as a duplex if it was legally allowed. And so you've got a lot of people split those homes and rented them out. Then the tide began to turn in the 90s. And somewhere in the mid to late 90s, highest and best use shifted back to being single-family homes. And that's the case with most of them today. They're probably worth more for a family than they are as rental. Why? Because rents and market values don't necessarily move in lockstep. And so when rents are moving more slowly than owner-occupant demand, that's going to shift. And more recently, we've seen the owner-occupant demand return faster. Even though rents are starting to increase again, they're not increasing as fast as the owner-occupant demand. Increasing and diminishing returns. I put up here, not all improvements are created equal. If you put money in that you're not going to get back, that's a diminishing return. If you put money in and you're going to get a positive return, that's an increasing return. Just like we were talking about with Remodeler Magazine. Where am I going to get a positive return on my dollar? So that's just the idea of increasing and diminishing returns. Again, learn before you start talking a lot to buyers and sellers what the things are that they can do where they can make money. Sometimes it's kitchen and bath remodels, say today, you know, painting, maybe a little bit of landscaping stuff. Whatever the surveys are showing is working well in the market. Stay abreast of that. Let's go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back and finish this, pick up with plottage after this. If you can all be back by about 3 minutes after or something like that, that gives us 15 minutes. Braden, do you want to pause this or?